All right. I think my computer might die, so I'm gonna go grab my cord. But you still have 5 minutes to kind of complete the quiz if you haven't done so. Hello, hello, welcome. So I have to apologize, guys. I still have not graded your midterms. I've just been struggling lately, just kind of depressed and falling asleep, spending a lot of time unconscious. And so I will get on those. I only have 3 left. So I just gotta stay awake and do them as well as now your next analytic responses as well.
Well, I hope you start feeling better.
Oh, thank you. The light is helping. The fact that it's like sunshiny finally, and I can go outside, and I get my vaccine, the first one on Sunday. So that will also, I think, help make me feel like less trapped. Thanks, Crystal. I'm sure everyone's struggling. This has been such a weird year. All right. All right, last couple people are finishing. I am super excited to talk to you guys about Cavendish. She's super cool. And this is one of my favorite pieces by her. Thanks, Jack. I'm excited. Excited to get the vaccine. Okay. All right, so welcome. I'm happy to have you guys here. It's Tuesday, And there's not too much of the semester left, so that's kind of nice. So we'll be spending the next 2 weeks, including today, on Blazing World. And then there's not too much left after that of the semester. So cool. So Alessandra's presenting today, Crystal will present on Friday, and then Abby will present on Tuesday. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Alessandra.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm just gonna share my screen really quick and get started on the presentation. Can you guys all see that? Is it loading?
It's loading still.
Okay.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, it's loading on my screen still. There you go.
There we go.
Okay, so the Blazing World. So Margaret Cavendish, she was born in 1623 and died in 1673 at the age of 50. She was born noble, but she lived in exile in Paris during King Charles I's execution. She spent 15 years in exile with her husband, William Cavendish, and when King Charles II took over, they got their like land and wealth restored. So they were back into like a higher status because they ran up a lot of debts while in exile. And she was the first woman to be invited to participate in the Royal Society and the only woman for the next 100 years.
200.
And then I just have a really, really short video just with a little bit more information about her, just to give you guys a bit of a better idea of who she was. Sorry, my laptop's literally so slow.
No worries. Oh, we can't hear it.
Mm,
You might have to stop sharing and reshare with the sound
Okay, I'll try that.
box on. Yeah.
Where'd it go? Here it go. Can you guys hear it?
No.
Hmm.
Can you hear it, Alessandra?
Yeah, I can hear it.
Well, try stop sharing one more time, and this time when it asks you to share, there'll be a little box down in the left-hand corner that says share sound.
Yeah, I see it now.
Okay.
Okay.
Margaret Cavendish, an English philosopher who worked in the middle of the 17th century. To put Cavendish's publications in context, in the 16th and 17th century, the number of women whose works were published in print increased to the hundreds. However, most of these works were not published in quarto or folio format, what we would today think of as, quote-unquote, a book. To give her works respectability, she published her works in a format expected for scholarly works, the kind that would be included in university libraries, and commissioned the best possible publishers, printers, and illustrators. In her works, she experimented with a variety of styles and genres to express her views on natural philosophy. This also made her unusual compared to other philosophers of her day. Since scholars would not engage with her in public debate, given her public notoriety and her unusual ways of expressing her views, Cavendish sent her works as presents to well-known academics at universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. They could not refuse. She was, after all, one of the most prominent aristocrats in England. During the 1660s, Cavendish also became interested in the world of experimental philosophers such as Robert Boyle. On May 30th, 1667, she gained even more notoriety for being the very first woman to attend a meeting of the Royal Society. At the Society meeting, Cavendish observed Robert Boyle's experiments with the air pump and his experiments with mixing colors with the assistance of Robert Hooke. At a time when many women writers were concerned primarily with issues of religion and moral philosophy, or the education of women, Cavendish really trailblazed her way by developing a unique and very publicly presented position in natural philosophy. By the time of her death in 1673, she had developed a philosophical position which critiqued all the dominant materialist, mechanist, and dualist theories of substance and causation of her day. Cavendish criticizes Cartesian dualism, Hobbesian materialism, and the mechanist views of nature propounded by members of the Royal Society, such as Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke. According to many scholars today, Cavendish really staked out a completely new position that was distinguished from both the dualism and the materialism of her philosophical contemporaries. In the next few videos, we will accompany Cavendish on her visit to the Royal Society and look at her criticism.
So unfortunately, they never made the next few videos because I wanted to share those with you guys as well, but they never made any. So that's unfortunate. Why? Okay. So then we have Margaret and William. And William was 30 years older than Margaret, but she said that, you know, he was the only man she's ever loved. They seemed to have a very loving relationship, and he was also very supportive of her creative endeavors. And they actually published most of their books with their own finances. They didn't really have like publishers like paying them for their books or anything like that. And they also shared passions in writing and philosophy. She considered him her creative partner, and I think they very much supported each other when it came to that. And then this is from the beginning of A Blazing World, where she writes a letter to the reader, and in it she says that though I cannot be Henry V or Charles II, yet I will endeavor to be Margaret I. And though I have neither power, time, nor occasion to be a great conqueror like Alexander or Caesar, yet rather than not be mistress of a world, since fortune and fates would give me none, I have made one of my own. I believe this is one of like the most important quotes in the letter, because we really see how Margaret thinks. So she knows she can't have much power in her own world, that she's never going to be the ruler of a world. So she's going to make her own instead of settling for that. And I think that really gives us just insight on her personality and how she views herself. And I think she had a lot of confidence in herself in her writing, which I think is really admirable. So here's just a quick summary of the reading we did. The story begins with a girl of noble status kidnapped by pirates. Heaven gets very angered by this, and a storm blows the ship into the Arctic Pole. And this pole lies between two worlds. So bear men, which are pictured right here, find her ship and carry her to their world. And then upon seeing that she's not fit to live in the cold with them and eat what they eat, she is passed off from species to species until she reaches the emperor. And where the emperor lives, there are people just of all different skin tones, but none of them natural, like purple, red, blue, green. And she marries the emperor and is essentially given free range. With this, she sends, I call them her worshipers because they do worship her. She sends them to investigate all different things about nature and the world. And we learned that where she is called the Blazing World due to the large and bright stars. So this is William's influence in the Blazing World, and this is kind of a theory I came up with while reading, but I do believe that her marriage is reflected between the Empress and the Emperor, and though we don't really see the Emperor, he gives her free range to study the world. And Margaret described William as very supportive and who allowed her the freedom to explore creativity and philosophy, which was not common and often frowned upon for women of that time. And so the empress is given unlimited resources and power. And I think that's kind of how William made Margaret feel, being the supportive husband that he was. And this is just a little picture of the empress. And this is a fish man, and it looks like possibly tiger men all lined up around her. Religion in the Blazing World. So religion's a big thing. Is that I found especially interesting. So I have this quote at the beginning. It says, "Again, the empress inquired whether they had several forms of worship. They answered no, for our devotion and worship consist only in prayers, which we frame according to our several necessities, in petitions, humiliations, and thanksgiving." So that's on page 16. And in the Blazing World, they all practice one religion and serve under one God, and therefore serve under one emperor. So that made me wonder, well, is this a reflection of Margaret's own political views? Is she a fan of the monarchy? Which I'm assuming she would be, because Charles II was the one to restore her wealth and status. And the men and women worship and pray separately, which I thought was particularly interesting, because from what I know, she was Christian, and Christian allows men and women to pray together. So I thought it was interesting that she chose to write against that in her world. Philosophy and nature. So up until the empress arrived, citizens kind of agree on everything when it comes to like religion, politics, language. Once they begin investigating nature and things like the sun and moon, they cannot agree anymore. I believe this represents the uncertainty of that time. You know, philosophers at the time also had very differentiating opinions. And I think Margaret used this book to explore her own theories and beliefs based on her learnings. Oftentimes we see the narrator not really sure of what the answer is. And I think that was Margaret's way of kind of almost thinking out loud, like writing down her thoughts on these things while incorporating it into a story. And nature is also a huge theme in the Blazing World. The narrator often explains how things interact with nature versus then really describing what they look like. And even though like the diamonds, the gemstones worn, they're from nature, gold's from nature. It is also the focal point of the Empress's research is how nature works.
Yeah.
These are some quotes I have. So we have her accoutrement after she was made empress was as followeth. On her head she wore a cap of pearl and a half moon of diamonds just before it. On the top of her crown came spreading over a broad carbuncle, which is like a ruby, cut in the form of the sun. Her coat was of pearl mixed with blue diamonds and fringed with red ones. Her buskins and sandals were of green diamonds. I thought it was interesting that her crown had a half moon on it, and like her like there's like the, I don't know what this is, the cut in the form of the sun, but the fact that there was a sun and the moon, and those were things that they really didn't understand in the Blazing World before she came. But it shows that astronomy is quite prevalent in that society, and it's a nod to Cavendish's own interest in the subject. And then the other quote is, "But this opinion, again, was laughed at by others and rejected as ridiculous, who thought it impossible that one immaterial should produce another, and believed that both the light and heat of the sun proceeded from a swift circular motion of the ethereal globules,
Yeah.
which by their
Globules is probably better.
Yeah.
I always in my head read it as globs.
which by their striking upon the optic nerve caused light, and their motion produced heat." We see the most debate coming from the citizens when it comes to the sun. Up until then, they had kind of agreed on most things, but when it came to the sun, there was a lot of different opinions, and no one could agree on one. I also thought it was very impressive, the words she uses in this paragraph. It shows how much research she was really doing and how much interest she really had to be talking about the optic nerve and ethereal globules and the circular motion, all of that. I think it's really impressive, honestly, that she had done this much research and found a way to incorporate it into her writing. And then here's some critical questions. So, what do you believe the significance of the animal men in different races?
I think it was to like show that despite like, because they were all really different, but she kept using the word civility and like kindness. So I feel like it was meant to show that like no matter how different they look, because it was all pretty drastic. Like if you saw like a purple person and a green
Mhm.
person, like in our world, we don't see race like that because I feel like we're kind of conditioned to not ignore it, but not see it as such a drastic like exterior difference. So I feel like she used like the really extreme version of it and then sprinkled in there every time like, you know, they were so nice to me, they did this for me, they did that for me, they took care of me, they were civil. So I feel like it was kind of a way for her to like insert her own opinion on race and how people are supposed to like cohabitate together.
Yeah, that's along the same lines that I was thinking as well. Does anyone else want to speak on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a commentary on what her society thinks of race and how her society views race. You know, there's a lot of negative connotations going around. It's the start of modern slavery and modern racial views and everything. So I definitely think it's like a criticism of that
Mhm.
system.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so if no one else has anything to add, we can move on to the second question. Okay, so Margaret is writing in the first person, but she's like telling the story of someone else. What effect does this have on you as the reader?
So the point of view is confusing. Would you say?
I actually really like the point of view.
Okay.
I thought it made it feel almost sentimental and intimate. Kind of feels like a conversation or like a story that like a grandmother or a mother would tell.
Huh.
And not one that they'd read out of a book, one they would tell just from their head or something that's been passed down in their family. So I found it somewhat comforting, her point of view in the story.
Cool.
Um, does anyone like disagree or agree with that, or is there not really much thought?
I wasn't really confused by the like out of all the things I was confused about, the the point of view was not one of them. I was pretty easy to follow. I think I had to like read it out loud and then it was hard for me to grasp some of the like tiny details in the story because it was an easy read, but it was a lot of information. So I don't think it like took away from the story.
And that kind of leads into my next question, which is she also, as a narrator, admits to not knowing things about the world. Um, she doesn't give an explanation for anything. It's not like most novels or books where everything is very defined and very planned out. Do you think this adds or subtracts from the story? Does it make it feel more authentic, or does it take away too much information?
I think it adds to the authenticity because like nobody like telling a story like that's gonna know every single aspect and every detail. So I think like it just helps with the more like connection feel like between you and the story.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with that. And so the last question is, what do you think of the Empress's thirst for knowledge? And do you think this is a character that's a direct reflection of Margaret? We kind of already know that she writes herself into her stories, but um, I believe that like this character is supposed to be her. But I don't know if anyone else agrees with that.
I feel like it's almost a reflection of how she wishes that people, rather than criticizing other people's cultures, would inquire about it if they were to like come to a new land, like learn about what they think and what they believe and what they practice, rather than just like come to the land, take over, take everything, change everything, gentrify everything. Like I feel like the reason why she kept asking questions, even if she didn't like the answer, was to like genuinely be able to rule them in the best way possible because she didn't even want to usurp the throne like initially. So I feel like if she was gonna do it, like she wanted to do it right.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point of view. I actually didn't see it like that at first. So yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, I kind of want to like go off of that. Is that I was reading this thinking this is a really interesting early take on the difference between appropriation and appreciation,
Mhm.
and how like so because like so much that wasn't really even a concept at this time, either one. So it's like really interesting to see these incredibly early concepts of topics that are at the forefront of media today.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it also makes me wonder as well if she was possibly relating it to experience in Paris. I'm not sure if she spoke French when she went into exile.
She was
Um,
very bad at languages. It's this big source of shame for her.
yeah, so I'm sure, she related to the fear of this character, being around in a new place, not speaking the language, not knowing the people and their customs. Um, so it makes me think that maybe this empress's journey is kind of similar to her own, and in the way that this empress almost does what Margaret wishes she could have done while in Paris.
Just take over casually.
Yeah, she did it the right way. Like she just got carried to the throne. That's the way to go. And that's all I have.
Awesome. Great job. That was awesome. All right. I love Blazing World. It's one of my absolute favorite texts. It's the final and the biggest chapter of my dissertation. So fascinating. And she herself was also so fascinating. Yeah. Especially because of all of the contradictions. So the Cavendish bio or the Cavendish intro. So Alessandra kind of covered a lot of this. I'm gonna add only a couple details. She did grow up during the Civil War, and she was a lady in waiting for the Queen. For Queen Henrietta Maria, who was French, and she was part of that Queen's court when the king was beheaded. So she married William Cavendish. She was really shy personally. So like she wasn't very good. So in Alessandra's video, like all the men were like, well, we can't talk to her because she's crazy. But she was also like kind of awkward. She talks a lot about this. And she was depressed a lot. She was really shy. William Cavendish was kind of a ladies' man, but somehow like it worked for them. Her young William Cavendish's younger brother, so her brother-in-law, hung out with the best philosophers of the day, so Thomas Hobbes and Rene Descartes. Do you guys know those guys? Do you know? I mean, we don't have philosophy classes here, so I was a philosophy and literature double major, so like this kind of speaks to me. Thomas Hobbes, I'm going to actually show you a little bit of his Leviathan, which is like a political philosophy kind of thing. Rene Descartes is kind of the big thinker of the time. He's the guy who came up with like the I think, therefore I am kind of thing. She just knew a lot, and she was a strange mix of quiet and shy and also really bold and demanding. And I think like it's really kind of awesome and characteristic of a lot of women's experiences, like feeling simultaneously like you should be quiet and shy and that you're awkward, but also like you also want to rebel. So this is kind of why I like her as well. So she loved to experiment with genre and hybridity. And we're definitely going to see this. We've already actually seen it even in the first bit of Blazing World. So Blazing World kind of starts off, a lot of people write about this, like what is the genre of this thing? What would you say the genre of Blazing World is?
Fantasy.
What's that?
Fantasy.
Fantasy.
Maybe.
Good. Yes, fantasy. Some people say science fiction, because it's got machines and technology, right? Other people call it travel narrative. And then other people call it like a dialogue, a philosophical dialogue. It's all of these things, right? This is before a novel was like, supposedly this is before the invention of the novel by about 50 years. Daniel Defoe is credited with the invention of the novel, but this is definitely getting there. she actually thought of herself as kind of like a hermaphrodite. She liked to wear both masculine and feminine clothing together at once. So she would like wear masculine clothing on top, feminine clothing on the bottom, or kind of vice versa. She loved not just to experiment with genre in writing, but also like genre in dress and fashion and, public persona. She loved to challenge gender roles, but in a lot of ways, people read her work as monstrous because of this. So think about the last class that we did, and we looked at those two poems, and the guy was writing to this other woman who published, Hermaphrodite and Show, Indeed a Monster. Is that a hand, Maddie? Oh, okay. It's just a drink. All right. So we learn from the intro that they read her work as an effect of her disruptive or subversive sexuality and personality, not as interesting or subversive in its own right. So like she really got kind of like erased and ignored for hundreds of years. So she's really interesting because she's all about kind of playing with boundaries and breaking boundaries, but she's also very conservative politically. So she's very into like supporting the monarch. She believes in absolute monarchy, absolute sovereignty. So she's got some real conservative political ideas and some really kind of progressive and liberal, and did I say subversive, progressive, liberal, subversive kind of ideas about social ideas. So politics and social, like it's she's very complicated, which I think makes it really fascinating to kind of figure out kind of, a lot of people read this as a kind of problem for a lot of the early women writers, that they are politically very conservative, but I think it's really interesting. Okay. So Cavendish was born, Charles I was driven out, and the Civil War began when she was around 1617. A year later, she becomes Queen Henrietta Maria's lady in waiting. A year later, she goes to France. And then a year later after that, she marries William Cavendish. So she was about what, 22 when she married, and he was like 52. He actually outlived her, which is kind of crazy. Anyway, and then 4 years later, Charles I was beheaded. A couple years after that, she took a trip to England and she published poems and fantasies. And then a couple years after that, she published Nature's Pictures and A True Relation of My Life, which is kind of like a memoir. And then in 1660 was the restoration of the monarchy. A few years later, she published Sociable Letters. And then in 1666, she publishes, I have publishes rights, it should be just publishes, Blazing World, which she appended to, so it was like the last part. So the real thing she published was Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, and then Blazing World was kind of attached at the end. And then a year later, she was invited to visit the Royal Society. She died in 73, around 50. Okay, so let's think about discussion 18.1. What was happening in the world in England when Cavendish was growing up and then while she was writing? And how do you see this kind of reflected in Blazing World? I mean, we've talked about this already because Alessandra's presentation was excellent, but like just to kind of take a bit of notes for yourself and kind of concretize your ideas, write it in 18.1. I'm going to give you like 4 minutes to do that. Okay. Okay, like take another minute. Take like one more minute. Yes. Right. Okay, so some of the things you guys talked about is like the Civil War, and kind of the explosion of women writing. So in my dissertation, I kind of talk about this. So like I think that during the interregnum, there was like a really kind of, especially after they kind of executed Charles the First, I think there was a real kind of interesting kind of fragmenting of power, so that like everyone starts to kind of reach for sovereignty or manifestations of sovereignty, personal power. They want to remake the world kind of better. And I think that like women were especially like doing this, even though like within a few years that's kind of like lost to them. So Civil War, and kind of like challenging the king and challenging the idea of divine rule and kind of exploring other ways to think, kind of, I think that's part of what inspired Blazing World. I also think that like the idea of war and escaping war is kind of definitely there, in some of the things that Cavendish was writing about. Let's see, what else do I have for you guys? Oh, I don't know if you read in the intro, but like, did you read what Virginia Woolf wrote about her? So I have so you guys know Virginia Woolf, right? She's kind of a big deal. And she was a kind of a modernist. So she lived in like the early 20th century. So she read Cavendish, and this is what she said about her. Though her philosophies are futile and her plays intolerable and her verses mainly dull, it's like she basically says like she's a terrible writer. The vast bulk of the Duchess, so like she wrote a lot, but the vast bulk of it is leavened by a vein of authentic fire. One cannot help following the lure of her erratic and lovable personality as it meanders and twinkles through page after page. There is something noble and quixotic and high-spirited, as well as crack-brained and bird-witted about her. Her simplicity is so open, her intelligence so active, her sympathy with fairies and animals so true and tender. She has the freakishness of an elf, the irresponsibility of some non-human creature, its heartlessness and its charm. What do you think? Let's talk about backhanded praise, right?
I don't think Virginia Woolf likes her very much.
She so Virginia Woolf, another thing she said about her is like in the garden of women's writing, like Cavendish sticks out like an overgrown zucchini. So instead of being a flower, she's like a giant phallic symbol. So some of this will help to kind of, so if you find Cavendish kind of confusing, you're definitely not the only one. She's like she was often kind of dismissed as just a crazy person, crack-witted, crack-brained, bird-witted, right? And she, like, her refusal to kind of work in genre and form kind of also led her to be dismissed as like a terrible writer. Her philosophies are futile, her plays intolerable, her verses dull. So what are some of the things that did kind of confuse you about Blazing World? Just the language, or
For me, it was the animal men. I almost thought of it as a way of her kind of exploring evolution.
yeah.
Um,
Although Darwin is not
because
around until much later.
yeah, that's why, because obviously like foxes didn't evolve from bears, but almost the way that each species
Oh,
led her
okay.
to the human beings.
Yeah.
It made me think of evolution. I don't know if that's what she was kind of thinking of, about how people came to Earth, came to be. Those are the thoughts it gave to me, was incorrect, but somewhat evolutionary.
Well, I mean, she is getting progressively more into civilization, so I think there's a support for that reading. Maddie?
Yeah, I want to like go off of what you just said, because that is exactly what I thought when I first read it and first read about like the foxes and I just thought, oh, it's Darwinism. And then I had to like stop for a second and be like, Darwin didn't exist yet. The evolution wasn't really even a word.
Right.
Backtrack.
But just because like it wasn't a scientific theory doesn't mean like, yeah, doesn't mean like necessarily that it wasn't like a thought that occurred to people, right?
No, but I think one of my biggest things, like while reading that, is like I immediately went, because of her relationship to like religion and everything, and Darwin's relationship to religion, I immediately juxtaposed like, oh, that's definitely like Darwinism is exactly what she's right. It was not. It's not.
Or at least
They're
she's got
so
a pre-Darwinism thing, yeah. And that's what actually, there's a lot of her ideas in here that actually are very kind of prescient, which that kind of like is like means like it like she's predicting what's gonna happen in the next kind of 100 years through philosophy and science. And because she was written off as nuts, like a lot of that was lost. So when I look at the epilogue to the reader, I think it's really good to think about like both conservatism and subversion, absolute rule and female rule, and like, so thinking about Elizabeth and thinking about Charles, thinking about, you know, sovereignty. So this is one of the first statements about fiction and what fiction is and why it's important in the entire 17th century, long before fiction kind of emerges as a thing. So a lot of people see her as like actually writing fiction before fiction was acknowledged to exist. She says she's not covetous, just ambitious. And because she can't have real political power, she's going to have literary power. So she creates a textual world to rule, and additionally, and more importantly, have absolute control and power over. So this is like so fascinating to me. What do you think about this decision to create a world in which she has absolute power and control, in which she's not just the ruler, but the creator? What do you think?
I think that's something that like all like during especially that time that all women kind of wanted, in a sense, you know, like they weren't really like able to speak their mind, and like the men kind of ruled everything just in general. So the fact that like during this time period that women even got a chance to even like write about like what they're feeling and stuff, like the fact that that's what she wanted, so people writ her off as crazy because she wanted power, like a normal thing that women should have, and people thought that she was crazy for wanting it.
And for like taking it, right?
Yeah.
As well, like, you know, and for her husband letting her take it, like it made a lot of men crazy. Maddie and then Alessandra.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I also thought that it kind of showed her displeasure with the world already around her.
Yes.
So she kind of created a new one to fit what she wanted, a world that was very, very peaceful and very unanimous when it came to decisions. So there's no war, there's no language barriers, there's no fighting no crusades, you know what I mean? So
A religious
I think
conflict. Yeah.
I think it almost shows that with all the conflict going on in her world, she just wanted a world where there was peace.
I don't know about you guys, but I often feel like this. So like if they would just make me in charge, things would be so much better. But like this is her like doing it. Go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's almost like a female view of colonialism.
Yeah.
It is.
So like
it's a subtler,
but like a
more gentle colonialism.
Well, that's always my question, like, is it colonialism? And if so, what kind of colonialism is it? And like, and why put it in science and in fantasy? And like, it's fascinating, especially once we get to the end. I can't wait till you guys read the like last bit because it blows your mind. But anyway, yes. So she's really kind of thinking about, okay, like, so, you know, the Civil War is over, the interregnum is over, Charles is back in power. So, you know, definitely. And like she has to kind of support, you know, the monarch's absolute kind of rule kind of ideology, but she also wants more power herself. So I think it's awesome that she kind of goes through and does it through writing and creation and you know, language. So okay, so opening of Blazing World. How does the main character get to Blazing World? I think Alessandra kind of did this in her summary. She's kidnapped by pirates. I think it's important to kind of remember that like the lady begins the expedition totally kind of submissive and without any power or agency, right? So this guy falls in love with her and he kidnaps her and she's kind of stuck on a boat, right? But then she travels from this world into another one through a pole. Have you guys read The Golden Compass?
No, but I've heard of it.
Okay. I actually had a whole class on like this, like grad class on the Golden Compass, and this it might be worth reading because like the Golden Compass is totally from Cavendish and John Milton's Paradise Lost. So like someone goes up to the North Pole and they end up crossing into another world. There's also like there's a new HBO series on the Golden Compass as well. It's called His Dark Materials is like the series. So I think it's really interesting because like the colonialism that Maddie was just talking about, like everyone at this point is going either to the East, to China and Japan and the Middle East, or, you know, West to Americas, the Americas. Cavendish is like, nah, I'm going to go north into another world. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay. The peoples of the Blazing World. We've talked about bearmen. We've talked about foxmen. There's also birdmen, right? And, you know, Crystal kind of already kind of hit this on the head, the idea of like civility. So she keeps thinking like, oh my God, animals, like, you know, they're gonna be even worse than the pirates are, and actually they're way better. And so it kind of puts pressure on the idea of civilization and savagery and who is the real savage. And it reminds me of that line from the last thing we read, like, God, I'm trying to remember, like animals, whatever, it doesn't matter. Humans kind of prove their own kind of, oh, you know what, this is not for this class, it's for the independent study that I was doing with Abby. But Abby, do you remember that line like from A Far Cry from Africa where he says like nature kind of beast on beast, you know, that's kind of normal, but like people prove their divinity through cruelty or something. So yeah, like it's almost like people are the worst, most savage, and if we were just a little bit closer to animals in nature, we'd be a lot more accepting, a lot more civil. I was gonna show you Hobbes the Leviathan, maybe if I have time. I love her idea of men who are green and purple and blue. And here we get to kind of more questions of colonialism. So is the Empress a colonialist?
I said no. Because she very much worked hard to assimilate herself into their language and their culture. She doesn't argue about their religion. She doesn't try to force any of her beliefs on them. And she's even taking time to learn about the workings of their world so she can rule it better.
Yes. So, and I think that's right. Like she does her best to assimilate. Like she's like, well, these people are pretty nice. I think I'll learn their language. Tell me about your world. So there's evidence that maybe she's not a typical colonialist. What might be some evidence that maybe it is a bit colonialist though?
Like
She
the fact
does.
that she accepted sorry, Maddie, the fact that she accepted the throne in the first place, like when she really, if you look at it in retrospect, didn't have any right because she had just gotten there. But
And
like I don't believe that personally. I think she went about it the right way.
yeah. And it's a common colonialist fantasy, right? Go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was gonna say. Is like this is the ideal of colonialization. This is like what it's marketed. Like it's weird to say that a concept this big is marketed, but it was marketed
Yeah.
to a lot of people as we're going to go in and we're gonna immerse all of these people in our culture and we're going to be immersed in their culture and it's not going to be hostile and they're going to love us and they're going to put us up on pedestals and
They're gonna think I'm a goddess, right?
yeah, same. They're gonna think that we're these great rulers and we're eventually going to rule them, and then when you got to the reality of it, it was hostile takeovers and subjugation of a lot of cultures. This is a very idealized, like I think it's very pro-colonialism, but it's a very pro-idealized colonialism.
Or a pro-textual colonialism, right? Like this is kind of what I end up with when I think of Blazing World. She's like, you know, if you need to go out and conquer a world, why don't you just write a world? And that way people are not going to fight you, right? And so it's like it's a weird take on colonialism. You can be a colonist, you can colonize any world you want, just like do it on paper instead of in life, and then no one gets hurt. So that's why I think she's so fascinating. Like she's like, and it's always kind of a question like, how real is the power that she kind of claims? Like it's totally indirect, but does it make it any less real? And all right. Do you think that her main character who becomes empress is pro-colonialism or anti-colonialism? We talked about how she assimilates and how she kind of tries to be respectful. And I think that as of now, that is true, that she is kind of respectful, but she is also kind of the one on top. What are some of the characteristics of Blazing World? We talked about this. It's very peaceful and courteous. It's kind of like the anti-England at this time. So although people are very different physically, there's one language, there's one ruler, there's one religion. It's not Christianity, and that's okay. All right. So there's no religious conflict, there's no conflict over sovereignty, and there's no language barriers. It's also super technologically advanced. So she's got that description of the ships that fit together like honeycombs, and they also like suck in air and push it out and like propel themselves. It's very kind of, in places, it's very science fiction-y. And it's also beautiful and naturally rich. All right. What happens to the lady? She learns language, she appreciates the people, and the emperor wants to worship her as a goddess. This is what we said in Imperial Fantasy. When he learns she's human, he marries her and gives her absolute power to rule and govern all the world. And the first thing she does is erect schools and societies for discussion and learning. Pro-colonialist or anti-colonialist move? Does it matter?
It's kind of like a Robin Hood, not Robin Hood thing, but like doing the best you can with like a bad principle, I guess. You know what I mean?
I'm not sure I do.
Like if the first thing you did after you took over someone's land was make something good out of it, like
yeah.
about schools, like
Trying to make
the principle of it, of you taking over, is not positive, but like the result is.
And maybe the intentions are too, right? She has good intentions, I think like she kind of wants to kind of like, learn more about things. She wants to inquire more. She looks around at this perfect society and says, what can I offer? Maybe schools and learning. That would be a cool thing. And the nice thing, you guys were also getting to this, is like she doesn't like think she knows it all. Right?
It is interesting to me that she chose them to all worship one deity and agree on one god, but then say that she's worshipped as a goddess, but they're not polytheistic from what we know. So I don't know if that's just like a flaw, just like she didn't really see that at the time, but
Okay.
I just realized.
This you're actually bringing up the best point that I can do to prepare you guys for the rest of this reading, which is that like Cavendish doesn't care if things are coherent. So she can say things like, oh, there's one god and also I'm a goddess, and because it's like text, and she doesn't really kind of like care if it's like a coherent story, if it makes sense, she can kind of just do it. This is going to be it's going to get weird and messy. Blazing World is like the first part generally pretty standard and good and cool to talk about, and then it's going to get real messy, and then it's going to end in like okay, so just kind of put aside your kind of all of your kind of stuff about like coherent storytelling. Okay. Yes. But yeah, Alessandra, you're exactly right. Like now I've lost my train of thought. I love that she's kind of like, she's like, okay, I don't know much, and I think I should learn. And she's like, tell me about your world. And like I read this as her kind of like Cavendish kind of taking the position of Socratic ignorance. You guys know anything about Socratic ignorance? So Socrates was like, the truly wise man is the man who knows he doesn't know. Like that's kind of his like famous kind of position. And so like if the empress doesn't know, like she can just ask all the experts, which also allows Cavendish as the creator or the writer to kind of be both ignorant and all-knowing, right? Make sense? Does that make sense? Okay. So she splits all of her societies into different experts depending on their race, right? So the bear men become chemists, right? I'm trying to remember what all the men become. There's a definite absence of women in this text, right? Which is like kind of worrisome. And then the like she comes in and she's like, all right, I'm going to put you into gosh, the giants are the architects, right? The architects, she made a convocation. She asked the birdmen, so the birdmen are astronomers. What else?
I thought it was funny how the foxmen were politicians because foxes are like sneaky.
Yes, and cunning. Yeah. I think this is farther than we read for today, so that's definitely not it. But like the lice men or something. Okay, the bear men were experimental philosophers. The bird men, astronomers. The fly, worm, and fishmen, natural philosophers. Ape men, chemists. Satyrs, physicians. The foxmen, politicians. The spider and lice men, her mathematicians. The jackdaw, magpie, and parrot men, her orators and logicians. The giants, her architects. All right, but before all these things, she decided to be informed about the matter of their religion. Okay, do you find anything worrisome about this? A lot of scholars kind of look at it and like see it as maybe a little racist. Maddie, I don't know how to interpret your look. Like
A little?
a little, yeah,
A
right.
little?
Yeah, where people are organized into different groups depending on their biological characteristics,
This
right?
is some Jim Crow level BS right here. This is not.
Right, yeah. Like and they're made to produce knowledge. Foucault has this is what he calls biopolitics, that like, people are kind of separated according to their biological differences, and they're kind of made to produce certain kinds of knowledge to kind of distract from the fact that they're like segregated. And so what do you think? So this would be another way that she's kind of like a really problematic colonizer, right?
I didn't really see them as like separated because they all at the end of the day come together to talk about their things. Well, it is weird that she assigned them jobs based on species. I mean, it makes sense that the birds are the astronomers because they can go closer to the sky.
Right.
And it makes sense that the fish and the flyworm both do natural philosophy because they both exist in different realms of the natural world, water versus land. So that's kind of how I looked at it. But I also, the fact that it's animals also kind of takes away race for me. So I didn't really pick up on those undertones as much.
Right. Yeah. So that's the other question. Like, well, if they're animals, like, is it really racist? What if they're, but it does feel, I was always pretty convinced that about this whole, like, that this is pretty problematic. Like, this is,
I think,
not great.
One of the biggest things is like, you can't both say that her motivations are good in writing these animals is wildly different, because it's a commentary and criticism of societal views of race, and then also say that this isn't racist, and very pointedly kind of conducting propaganda for slavery.
But also like scientific racism, right? Some people are naturally good at, I mean, this is one step away from like, boys are just naturally good at math, like, right? Like the kind of attributing like natural kinds of knowledge is like to certain people with biological differences. I think it's like, it's another one of those fascinating complexities of this thing that is like both subversive and very much like not subversive, very problematic and worrisome. Like the lack of women like in this thing is another way. Like she writes her epistle to the reader and is like, women, don't agitate for political power, just write books. It's like, no. Women should probably get some political power as well, right? Like you should act like, so like she's very tricky. Like in some ways she's so empowering, and in other ways she's so disempowering. And this is probably just part of being a woman writer in any point in history, right? So some of the themes that I see so far in this thing, what do you guys think? Themes, if we were going to read this as kind of a more traditional thing, what are some themes you can look for and look at? Big one for me. Others?
Imperialism. I know it kind of goes along with that, but
imperialism and also utopia, right? Thinking about Gonzalo and his perfect world and everyone who looked at the island of the Tempest. I mean, she has to have been thinking about the Tempest because the Tempest kind of rises to punish people, like at the beginning, right? So utopia, perfect world, paradise, richness and kind of material wealth, which is another kind of element of colonialism and the desire for colonialism. Civility and civilization versus like savagery, assimilation versus colonialization, and Maddie, you said earlier, like appreciation versus appropriation, right? Similar, right? Assimilation would be appreciation, colonialism would be appropriation. Also the view of nature versus artifice. She talks a lot about artificial things, and that's going to be kind of a really interesting binary that she pulls up and maybe kind of dismantles. Peace versus war.
Would enlightenment be one? Like,
Yes. Yeah. Enlightenment and learning and knowledge. Yeah. I think also discourse, right? And like the role of words in kind of making and remaking the world. All right. Final discussion. You guys got a couple minutes to kind of do this. What do you think is the role of science and discussion to establishing and maintaining power? And what role does it seem to play in the blazing world? Stop sharing, give you a couple minutes to do that. I think this is such an interesting question, especially now, in our post-Trump world, like what is the role of science in, establishing and maintaining power? Right, so you can take more time if you want. What I'll do is I'll count 2 of your answers for discussion day 18. So like if you answer 18.1 and 18.3, that'll be 3 points, or 18.1 and 18.2, that'll be 3 points. Basically like try to answer at least 2 of those discussions, whichever 2 you'd like for next class. I don't know if you noticed, but like if you're curious about kind of some of this stuff, you can always look at like these recommended readings. So this one is like Christina Malcolmson wrote a really good chapter. So race, gender, and the response to Boyle in Blazing World. Let's see what else we got. Serber's Utopian World of Her Own. These are what scholars say about Cavendish. For next time, that we're really getting into the science. And so like, yeah, it's gonna be trickier because it's all philosophy, and philosophy is hard to read, but good. Crystal is presenting on Friday, and I can't wait to talk to you more about Blazing World and philosophy and knowledge and discourse and writing and gender. All right.
Erin, could you stay for a couple minutes?
Ken, yes. All right. Have a good day, everyone. I'll see you Friday.
Thank
bye,
you.
have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
Great day, Professor.
You too. Hold on. Let me stop sharing. Let me stop